start to kind of look out into the future world of craft, it's clear that the segment is becoming more fragmented. The largest established craft brewers are getting stronger. The number of top 50 suppliers that are partnering up and joining Anheuser-Busch or Miller Coors or Constellation is growing. And the industry's just, the business is getting more complex. At the same time, you have a vast long tail that's growing, 4,100 breweries. And there's a sense that there are brands kind of caught in the middle that are getting pinched or squeezed from both sides. You have the larger brewers at the top really flexing their muscles and using their resources to their advantage, and the smaller brewers coming behind them that are a little bit more niche, a little bit more local than you are. So our question really for Simon was, what's going to happen to the brands that are in the middle? And so that's what we set him out to do, to figure out, sent him on a little bit of a fact-finding mission to figure out what's happening to those brands and what can they do to ensure that they're successful long-term and that they don't get squeezed. So with that, Simon Thorpe, where are you? Uh-oh. There he is. He emerges. Simon, thank you.
All right, thanks. Hello, everyone. So the most difficult presentation of the afternoon. Yeah, lower your expectations now on what this is going to be. Okay, so no great revelations, but as Chris said, one of the things that's happening at the moment is that there are a lot of competing pressures. 4,100 breweries in America now. There's kind of a lot of people out there. There's a lot of things that people thought were a brilliant original idea, and there's 10 other people doing the same thing. There are a lot of pressures, both internal that we create for ourselves and some things which are real external pressures on our breweries. And I thought what we do is just run through a few things in terms of looking at this in terms of the squeeze. And so to kick off, first one. What I'm going to look at is just three things. This idea of the brewery squeeze, what are we facing? What do we really mean by that? And then look at a window of opportunity. So this squeeze, if it's really happening, then is it something that we can work on, that there are opportunities to fight our way out of it? Or are actually a lot of things actually getting closed off to us as options right now? And then thirdly, how can we avoid it? Do you want to be juice or do you want to be pulp at the end of it? So there's only 3 slides here. The first one is just looking at the internal and the external factors that define what the brewery squeeze could be. And you could probably, I'm sure, in the room add maybe another 10 to this list, but they struck me as some of the most relevant ones right now, right today, where we are. The first one, in terms of looking at external stuff, is what's going to happen with chain retail. And a lot of us have a number of supermarket chains or liquor store chains, on-premise chains that we sell through, and they are incredibly powerful customers of ours. If you get it right, damn, it works beautifully. But the things that they are focused on as we think about the next 18 months to 2 years, I think are going to be some of the most defining decisions that will happen to craft. Their decisions on rate of sale in the next 3 shelf resets are going to be pivotal, because there's a lot of craft out there. There's a lot of space being given to craft in particularly an off-premise chain. And they're looking at a lot of data, and they're looking at how rate of sale is moving. So the simple outcome of this is, if you're not rotating, you're going to get cut pretty soon in the next 1, 2, maybe 3 shelf resets. Someone else is going to come in behind you, but these are going to be transforming shift jumps downwards in your business. So it's all about making sure that you've got rate of sale, that you've got programming, that you're engaged with these retailers, and that you're not overstretched with them, and you're not just sitting on shelf and getting dusty. The second thing is then, as Chris said, kind of large-scale breweries. And one of the important pieces that, as small craft breweries, we need to remember is the extent to which large breweries have one wonderful ability that small breweries don't have. They have the ability to really force distribution. Now, they have muscle. So they can walk into an account and they can say, take this and this. And as the bigger craft breweries are starting to play, the bigger breweries are starting to play in craft, that is going to become a bigger and bigger factor. So let's say that you want to take my macro beer, but I'd also like you to take my portfolio of craft beers. Third thing then is wholesaler distribution systems. Hands up anyone in the room whose wholesalers are not saying, I've got too many different beers at the moment. I mean, you talk to any decent wholesaler in the country right now, and they're struggling with the whole idea of how do I actually manage this portfolio of brands that I have? And they're managing the pie. So let's say that there's 400 tap handles available, and they've got 200 craft brands. They're consciously looking at this pie and saying, well, how am I going to divvy up the 400 tap handles that I've got available? And you can walk in there and you can have the best thing since sliced bread in your beer bottle. They're looking at saying, well, you're just one of 200 that I've got, and I've got to keep you all happy. And I'm going to make some choices myself as to the ones that I think are the real ones. So going back to a couple of things that Adam said earlier, it is critical that you stay really, really close to your wholesalers right now, because they're making decisions over the next couple of years that will define whether or not you're in and getting share of mind, share of the pie, or whether you're just going to be, yeah, okay, fine, thanks for coming in, but that's not going to fly. We're going to probably see some pricing contraction. It's kind of inevitable as you study different markets. At a certain point in time, there is some pricing contraction that's going to happen. Is it going to happen on Tuesday, Thursday, next month, or the year after? I haven't got a clue. But as we think forward, something is going to happen at some point. There are just too many people playing, and there's too much at risk for it not to start polarizing. So what we think is probably going to happen is that there's going to be this kind of split. Some brands are going to be able to sustain very higher pricing, but a lot of other brands are going to have to look very hard at where their pricing is in order to remain on shelf and competitive. And there's a ton of short-term noise that distracts us. So as we're starting to think about some of these bigger questions of what are we going to be and how are we going to survive this squeeze, one of the biggest challenges that we face is actually the fact that today we've got 20,000 things that we've got to get done. I've got to get beer out of the brewery. I've got to get it on shelf. I've got to get my sales force happy. I've got to pay payroll. There are 20,000 things that are happening right now. And I think this is the kind of point as we're evolving when all of us as craft brewers, as people who are trying to build a business, have to, at certain times, we have to stop and you have to cut out the noise and you have to start to think about what the next 3 to 5 years looks like. If all we do is just keep going on doing everything that we're doing today and we don't get our heads up and start thinking about it, we're going to get caught out because something will happen that we just haven't anticipated. That leads on to then 2 or 3 internal factors for breweries. I look around the room here, I visit different breweries, and a lot of them are really stretched thin. They're trying to do as much as possible with tiny amounts of resources, and they've spread those resources very, very thin. So they've basically taken the jam and they've spread it all over the toast in an effort to grow, but then they've woken up to the fact that they're actually spread very, very thin, and it's not sustainable. And as you look at your own breweries, you've got to, I think about, am I focused, or is my jam spread very thin on the toast? A lot of brands look the same, 4,100 breweries. How many of them are great? I come from here, I've got an IPA, and I'm really, really good. And they're diffuse, and they look the same, and they just represent the same things. And that may work from place to place where things don't necessarily exist overlapping each other, but you take a market like San Diego. We've got so many brands in this market, and a ton of them look identical. They look the same. So one of the challenges as we think about who's going to thrive and who's going to survive and who's not going to make the cut is the extent to which we really look different from each other. And then the final point is that the financial risk profile, and this starts to get a bit esoteric, but the financial risk profile of breweries is starting to increase. As you get more competition, it's more risky to launch a brewery. As certain opportunities start to get closed out to us, it becomes more risky. The costs of playing in the game are going up. It becomes more risky. As you're growing, so you go from a 7-barrel system to a 20-barrel system to a 50-barrel system, the risk profile of your company and your brewery starts to become that much greater. And there are a lot of breweries right now who are facing these step jumps up, and they're having to make very big decisions on their personal capital, on the investment, the amount of debt that they want to take on in order to try and grow to the next level. So financial risk is starting to become a bigger and bigger issue for a lot of craft breweries from a number of different directions. Does that all make sense? Second slide is really about this window of opportunity. How quickly is this thing coming towards us? I have no idea, really. Again, it might be Tuesday next month, or it might be 2 years down the line, but it's probably coming. And the overall point of this part of the discussion is you've got to find some time to think about how you're going to prepare for it, because it will probably come quicker than we think, and you've got to be ready for it. So a couple of thoughts on this. I think firstly you have to say, what window am I looking through? So if, for example, your brewery is focused on saying, I'm going to be an export brewery, and there are two or three breweries in the country who have really nailed this down, and they've said, we're going to get damn good at exporting to Europe. And they're building an operating model that will capitalize on this American craft wave in Europe right now. It's really clever. Europe is open, but your brand has to be able to travel. Think of a couple of things that were said as we went through the presentations of the startup breweries. Can this brand travel beyond this state? Can this brand travel out of America and get to Europe and beyond? So this idea of Europe is open, wide open right now. Anyone who can construct a brewery that can ship American beer successfully at decent margins into Europe and stands for something that means something in Europe, it's still the wide open places. Local is probably going to remain indefinitely open. There is this wonderful trend that people are just celebrating things that are made in their own backyard. They can identify with it. They feel a sense of ownership and an emotional connection to things that are close to me. And in a big country like ours, that is particularly relevant. But, and a couple of other people have mentioned it today, it's almost becoming a rotating window. So there are so many local breweries in San Diego that, just pick the next one. And you don't need, if one fails, bring on the next one, bring on the next one. So this whole idea of rotating local is as important an idea, I think, as rotating tap handles. And as we think about the number of local breweries who are pinning their hopes on being the local brewery in Lincoln, Nebraska, they're going to rotate as more and more of them come through. National, if your ambition in life is to be a national craft brewery, I think it's starting to get too late. The door is closing. The ability to really become national, to get that scale at this point in the evolution of craft is probably starting to become very tight. It's going to take someone remarkable to be able to break out and become the next truly national brand. There may well be someone, but it's not something that you should set up as your initial premise of starting your brewery, that I'm going to be national. Great, it's coming. It's really, really difficult, and it's become much more difficult in the last 2 years. And then we can look at this slightly differently. You can say from a style perspective, a couple of other things are closing. I would argue that West Coast IPAs is closed. And the reason I say that is because a West Coast IPA is almost price of entry these days, and you've got to have a really, really good one. But you're not going to be distinctive and differentiated and original if all that you are is yet another West Coast IPA. So you can start to think about whether or not, as a brewery, you're playing in some of these style areas, and you can actually have something that's really different and original, and you can build your brewery on the back of it. The second question then is, are you actually fit enough to get through the window, even if you can figure out which one you want to be in? And a couple of people, again, earlier today, have started to reference some of these notions of the cost of production, the cost of logistics. These are going to be defining cost parameters for any craft brewery over the next 5 years, and we're going to have to pay a hell of a lot more attention to them than we have done in the past. Prices of materials are going to go up quite considerably over the next 5 years. The cost of shipping beer, even across half the country, has become really, really expensive. So as we start to think about how do we grow and how do we develop a brewery, The idea of becoming really, really good at understanding your production costs and your logistics, as Adam said earlier, is really, really important. Security of materials supply. There was a piece in the film about access to materials supply. 4,100 breweries, they all want hops, they all want certain varieties. I mean, we've all had a little flurry in the tummy when we've had to go and buy on the spot market from time to time. It kind of makes you not feel very good. And signing up contracts for hop supply, malt supply, people out there are now buying out 5 to 6 years. And so the ability of us all to be able to secure really good quality materials supply is starting to become more and more of a pressure. So we've got to make sure that we're really good at that. And then we've got to have a really, really good distributor network. And again, come back to this point that if you're a wholesaler and your distributors, they've already got 200 brands and you're trying to develop yours, it's all about share of mind. So you've got to really focus on how are you getting a disproportionate share of mind for your brewery and your brands and your initiatives and your activation. Because if you don't have that, then you're going to become one of the also-rans. So that piece about understanding your wholesaler, speaking their language, making sure that you are delivering on their expectations as much as your own, is going to become a much more significant thing than it has in the past. They can pick and choose now. And they can pick and choose which breweries they think are going to be the bets for the brighter future. So you've got to make sure that you've positioned yourself in the right place to be one of those bets with them. And I think the third point is, if there's one thing that you take away from this, I think this is the most important. It's to decide what you want to be. Because as we grow and develop breweries, we have wonderful ideas about how our beers will develop. But it's going to become, as much as anything, about what your brewery stands for. And it's got to be original, and it's got to be distinctive. And it's all the things that we learned in Branding 101. But let's assume for the moment, and I'm not right in this, I know, but let's say that over the next 10 years, craft can become 20% share. Not unreasonable, let's say, for working purposes. What we've been thinking about is that being about a third, a third, a third. So roughly speaking, a third of the volume is going to be big national craft players, a third is going to be super regional, and another third is going to be local breweries. And this is roughly a third of the volume, not a third of the breweries. So let's, for working purposes, assume that's roughly about right. There are some very distinctive things that you could choose to be if you want to be. You can choose to be a very clear local hero. And you can be very, very happy, and you can make a ton of money, and you can be very successful being a local hero in a very defined, tight geography. And your job as a brewery is to make sure that you remain that local hero to everyone in Lincoln, Nebraska. Second thing you could decide to do is to say, I'm going to be a regional brewery because I've got an ambition to go a little bit beyond Lincoln, and I want to have the whole of Nebraska and a bit of Wisconsin as well, please. And so you can be a regional player. And you have to start thinking then about your brewery operating a very different way. And there's this whole idea about beyond 200 miles, your economics start to change. It's true. So you have to construct your brewery economics in a very different way. You could say, I have a faith that my brand can be a national player. And that's one of the most difficult challenges of all right now, because it's complicated and it's very pressurized and very crowded in terms of people who, and having something that can truly become a national breakout brand in America now is incredibly difficult. Or you could choose to be, let's say, I'm going to walk away from the 20 share and the third, and I'm actually going to focus on exporting. So I think even at a high level, you can make some decisions about what do we want to be. And then there's this whole idea about what does your brewery stand for. And we've seen some really great examples in the startup discussions of people who are really thinking about, with real precision, about what my brewery stands for. I'm going to be about this. And they're very clear about it. I would argue that that's not enough. Not only have you got to be very, very clear about what you want this brewery to stand for and your core values and your essence of what you are, you've got to make sure it's relevant to consumers. Because one of the things that happens is we brew beer, we get really excited, we think we love it, and we launch it, and then we find, nah, doesn't work, because no one else shares the sense that we have about our brands. So finding ways to test and evaluate and check that we're in the right places is going to become equally more important than it is today. And we don't have to do huge amounts of research on this. One of the beautiful things that we have is a lot of us have brew pubs, and we have direct access to people who come in and we give them an experimental beer and they say, I love it. We can engage through social media with people who already love and appreciate our brand and those who don't. So there are some tools out there that make it really easy for us to understand whether the thing that we've chosen to pin our brewery on actually works for people. Final slide. How do you avoid this squeeze? I mean, juice or pulp? I think there are a number of things, and there's some really great examples of people who are already doing it in craft at the moment. The first thing we should think about is something called threshold economics. I've got an idea, a theory here, which is if you've got 100,000 barrels, and going back to what Adam said, if you're really focused on getting your revenue per barrel above $300, you're going to make about 30 million in turnover, kind of simple math. And go back to the point Adam made about steady, sustainable growth. You know, everyone who dreams of 60% growth rates, I think, is smoking something, because I'd rather have 10 to 15, even 5% growth over a 20-year period than I would have 50 or 60% growth. It's incredibly difficult to manage anything more than 15% growth. Things like your cost of capital. You've got to invest so much money up front just to keep pace with it. So your financial risk is massively front-end loaded. You're always chasing capacity, and you're spending a lot of your energy and your resource on just filling the thing as it stands, instead of building the foundations steadily so that they endure and they work for a long time. It's about a sustainable level of resources. I mean, you're growing at 50 to 60%, boom, you've got to hire a whole chunk of people in a very short space of time. If you're able to add them steadily, in a considered way, purposefully, you can spend time finding the right people. You can build the foundations more easily. And it's about a certain level of EBITDA. If you get to this level of threshold economics, you're actually able to make enough money to service your debt, to invest in the capital that you need for your business, to build your resources and invest in your business and pay your people, and maybe take home enough money to be able to buy the G.I. Joe soldier for your kid for Christmas. So as you think about your P&L for your own brewery, dreadful, we don't like to think about it. We like to brew beer, we don't like to think about P&Ls. Think about these threshold economics. Have I got them balanced? And am I at a critical threshold? And if I can't see my way to getting to a critical threshold that I'm comfortable with, and it could be less than this, but I think this is about right for any long term, let's say 20, 30-year successful brewery. If I can't get there, then what should I do? Should I cut bait, move on, or is there a way that I can transform this? So let's say that you can find a way to transform it. If you feel a squeeze coming, then what could you do? There are a couple of examples. You can if you can see this and you've got the presence of mind to say, I'm in the wrong place, then you owe it to yourselves to reinvent yourself, and you can do it. Omegang's a good example. One of our small breweries, upstate New York. It used to be the only Belgian brewery in America. Everyone's got a freaking Belgian Saison this year. So it's price of entry for any decent brewery to have some decent Belgian beers. So just from a basic premise, the idea of Omegang as the only Belgian brewery in America, it's just history. Sorry, move on. So we've reinvented the brewery in a completely different place. And totally changed all the brand positioning, the packaging, the portfolio of beers. We used to be very stuck on a certain type of Belgian yeast. We're now wide open to and using different yeasts. So there is a way of, if you face up to the brutal facts of it, we can reinvent yourself. You can diversify, and I think there are some craft breweries that are being really, really clever at doing this. Sam Calgioni's past master at this. He's looking at retail. He's looking at taking the brand into food business. I look at what Boston Beer have been doing in terms of diversifying not away from the beer to the tea business and so on. These are companies that are thinking, right, okay, if I'm going to be squeezed in some fashion, then I can, if I diversify my risk, if I look at other opportunities to build my brand, then I've got a stronger platform to be able to thrive rather than just survive. I think one of the beauties of retail is if you're a startup brewery, retail is fantastic because you've got cash. It's all about cash flow. If you're a bigger brewery, then retail is all about engagement and participation and some of the things we talked about this morning. And it's about, we have this wonderful ability to touch our consumers and our drinkers and our fans. But it also can be a huge profit generator that can support weaknesses and ups and downs in the brewing side of the business. So I look at someone like Stone here in California. I mean, they're building out 7 retail locations, hotels, stuff like this. Things that help to increase the engagement with the brand, but also provide this tremendous revenue that can be a second pillar alongside their brewing. I think most importantly, one of the wonderful things about craft has been that it coincides, as David Walker said, it coincided with the explosion in social media. And the reason is that we were able to engage at a very low-cost level with a lot of fans and consumers who really were hungry for knowledge, and it was a really cheap way for us to engage on a very personal level with them. And we have to own that if we're going to survive this squeeze. And we've got to stay very, very close to our consumers and stay very, very engaged with them. The minute that we kind of back off and start to become rather corporate about this is the day that we start to lose it. And a great example for me is the way New Belgium do it. I mean, if you look at the percentage of money that they devote to social media versus point-of-sale material or glassware or other stuff, it's phenomenal. It's way ahead of anyone else that I've seen. And the content, the way that they engage, the breadth of it is really quite impressive. So as we think about holding on to our consumers and making sure that we're there, take a look at a very simple thing. How much am I spending on glassware? How much am I spending on POS? How much am I spending on wholesaler incentives? And how much am I spending on social media? And imagine that you could totally invert the equation. So let's say that today you're spending 10% on social media. Could you catapult that to 40? Because at that point you are really engaging with people and holding on to them. You can focus on a critical channel, and a good example for me here is Deschutes. If you look at IRI data, you can see it in spades that Deschutes have a disproportionate share in chain. And the reason for doing that is they've really focused on off-premise chain, and they've become very, very good at it. And traditionally, we've all built our craft businesses. We got a sample on-premise, and then eventually we'll go over here and we'll put it in chain grocery. I think the Deschutes model is much more interesting because they've actually spent a lot more effort and energy developing some very specific chains, and it's produced huge success for them. Because in developing relationships with a very few number of chains, they've been able to leverage that into a very big business. And there are lots of other places that we can play. No one has yet really cracked convenience channels for craft. And somewhere in the middle of this, there is a brand opportunity for someone to go and really nail convenience and make that their brand stands or falls on the convenience channel. So there are some ways of focusing on a critical channel. There's this idea of a home and away. All right, English, soccer, home, away. No? Fine. Home and away, it's not difficult to see. Firestone Walker has a completely different portfolio when they're playing at home in California and when they're playing away in New York. And it's important from a couple of perspectives. One is, it is a portfolio that operates at a completely different pricing level. So, but put crudely, they sell the higher end beers in New York, and that covers the cost of all the freight. And it's the beers that you can get easily into selective distribution at relatively low cost in New York, whereas the service costs for California in terms of freight are much lower, but you need to have much more extensive programming. So you can think about home and away portfolios as being a very interesting way to survive this. You can create a very well-defended heartland, and then you can have an expedition force that goes out to the rest of the country, but it can look completely different from the group of the portfolio that you need at home. And then there's the idea of, and we've gamed this out a lot at Boulevard in terms of, if it all goes pear-shaped, what do you do? And we said, right, well, let's look at all of our breweries and figure out where do we go if the bomb drops. And for Boulevard, we said we're going to double down in the Midwest because that's where we live, that's where we come from, that's where the heart of the brewery is. So we ended up taking a whole bunch of money that we spent in other markets, and we doubled down in 2015 and 2016 on the energy and effort that we were putting into our heartland. There are a number of breweries around the country, and rather than call them out, I think you can probably feel a number of them as much as see them, where their business is becoming hollow like a donut, and they're spending a lot of energy on expanding, but they're really forgetting about the heartland. When it all goes badly wrong, you hunker back down where you came from, and you've got to make sure that your heartland is well defended. And in the case of Boulevard, that's exactly what we decided to do in terms of making sure that the heartland of the Midwest was rock solid for us for the long term. And then in closing, I think there are an awful lot of short-term distractions right now. You only have to read anything in the beer media, and there's 20 things that can distract you. There are 20 things day to day that are getting in front of you. But you've got to take some time to think and to decide who you want to be, how you're going to survive this squeeze as it probably inevitably will come. And you've got to decide what your ambitions are going to be and decide how to really participate in that. Craft brewing is, I truly believe, is a long-term, a 50-year play. This is not cider. It's not flavored malt beverages. This is something that is a generational wave, and if we nurture it correctly, it's a 50-year play. So it's a question of figuring out in the middle of that who's going to thrive, who's going to survive, and who's going to pass by the wayside. And there is going to be some kind of contraction and squeeze on us as we think about the next 2-3 years or so. So with that, I'll open up for any questions.
Awesome. Over here.
You going to sit down?
Yeah, just for a minute. Why not? So I know we're a little over time, but a couple questions. You brought up this idea of diversification, and pointed to a couple different examples: Dogfish Head, Boston Beer. But that seems to run sort of in direct conflict with this idea of simplifying the business as well. So how do you sort of balance those two objectives to be a simpler outfit for wholesalers while diversifying at the same time?
I think it comes back to the idea of choose what you want to be. There are some breweries which have a brand that have something that they stand for that can be extended, and I think Dogfish is a very, very good example of that. I mean, there are some things in the values of the brand that can be extended into food, into restaurants, and so on. If you don't have that, you don't try and go there,
right,
because you'll screw up. And in the same breath, the simplification thing is about trying not to be all things to all men, but to try and decide to stand for one thing. The more precise that we are about who we are, the more consumers get it. In some of the startup presentations, I saw some confusing messages in terms of what they stood for. And we have to remember that in a crowded market, people who are walking in to buy a beer, be it in on-premise retail, they've got to get it like that. Otherwise, you've missed them and you've lost that trial opportunity. You've got to be very, very clear and simple about your communication.
Do you think that the larger brewers are doing a better job, or the larger craft brewers are doing a better job nowadays at simplifying their brand messages for consumers? Is that perhaps what is contributing to some of the downward pressure on those guys in the middle? They're just simplifying better?
Honestly, I don't know the answer. And I think, by way of a couple of comments, I think the major brewers are really, really smart. They always are. They always have been. It's taken them a little bit of while to figure it out, but they're very, very smart people, and they've kind of figured out a number of the ways to compete. I don't think they've really, really figured out how craft brands should work within their system, truly, and how they leverage them. They haven't necessarily really identified well with the craft breweries that they're buying or building. And they haven't figured out how to make a model yet where they can really get the type of evolution out of them that they're looking for. So typically they're looking for more scale rather than more margin.
Right.
I'm not sure that they've figured out how to take some of these craft brands and really blow them out. You know, this goes back to the point about how many more national brands can there be?
And it's still pretty early. I mean, most of these deals are very, very fresh, so it's going to take some time to see if they're able to execute. But getting back to this idea of understanding who you are and trying to figure out ways to make it through and to survive, it seems like there would be a lot of distractions that would kind of take away the attention from your core set of values, and whether it's Dogfish Head doing sausages or hotels, it seems like brewers in an effort to survive and explore those types of opportunities might end up just taking the attention away from what they should have been doing all along, which was staying true to who they are. So how do you identify an opportunity, go after it, and make sure that it still resonates with your core message?
It's a great point, because in terms of how do you get stuff done on this, I think it's almost like export. Sausages, they're all good examples. The last thing you do is get someone in your existing organisation to develop those forwards, because what will happen is exactly what you described. They'll get distracted. The core, the heart of why we do what we do will start to get diluted. Blech, horrible. So I think one of the most successful, certainly from our point of view, export development, we brought in a completely different group of people, dedicated them to getting it done. Ommegang food, good example. Outsourced it completely to someone who we've been working with for the best part of a decade. Love the brewery, we love them. Set up a completely different business unit to make that happen. It's not a distraction for the heart of what you're doing.
All right. Awesome. Well, I know we're way over time, and I want to try to keep this moving, but Simon, thank you very much. Round of applause.